I'm Jeff Kavanaugh, head of the Infosys Knowledge Institute, the thought leadership and research arm of Infosys. Today, we're talking about bias in artificial intelligence with John Bohannon, Director of Science at Primer. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Broadly speaking, what does Primer do and how is it taking advantage of these things? So we can set the baseline here.
I often describe Primer as a company that builds tools for people who have the word analyst somewhere in their job title. You'll find analysts in the government, find them in big banks, you'll find them in big companies like Walmart, and those are our customers. So we're an enterprise software company. We try and take your knowledge and encode it into machine learning engines, we call them. And then you can hook up those engines to do useful work for you. And that's the name of the game here.
Trust is such an important aspect of this. I'd like to get your perspective in three areas. One of them is the actual setup, like kind of rules do you have, the assumptions, and then we'll move into maybe the math, and finally the UX. What's the possibility for introducing inaccuracy, unreliability through bias at each of these 3 points? I think that's an interesting dimension that helps people either lose trust or gain it, depending on how they feel about what they know about it. So let's talk about the sourcing part.
Yeah.
When you think about this data, how do you choose what data to pull in and what rules to govern its structure?
We have a company value at Primer that we express in 2 words. We call it always human. And what it means to us is all the other values, all the other things that guide your decisions when you work at Primer, it really falls under this top level value of being always human. And that means always caring about outcomes for your customer, for the rest of the world. And I think that's just a tenet of good engineering. If you put on blinders and you just focus on the narrow little task, building some widget, and you don't care what the consequences are or how reliable it'll be in contexts other than the ones that are specified for you, then you're not doing good engineering. You got to care. You got to expand that circle of caring way beyond your little project, way beyond your team, way beyond your company, eventually to the whole world. And one of the most important dimensions of this kind of, we call it responsible technology, is bias. And so bias is one of the dimensions that you care about, especially when anything involves machine learning. Now, it turns out that all models have bias. Literally, you can't make a model without bias, unless it's so simple that it's just a toy problem. And most bias is harmless. In fact, a lot of bias is intended. You want the system to swerve towards some goal. The bias that we worry about, and we talk a lot about at Primer in terms of how to detect it, how to mitigate it, how to prevent it, is bias that harms people.
Is there anything that's different about those three? How you set up, how you actually run the math or stats, and how someone experiences it? For example, you can mislead people through charts and graphs, by showing in many ways. In your experience and in your company, where do you see, are they all equal but different? Or is there one area you really have to look for to make sure that bias doesn't creep in a harmful way?
What really stuck out to me of what you just said was that you can have things not be biased and still be misleading and cause harm. And I just think that's the most important point to make, actually, before we dive any deeper into bias and its math and how to deal with it, which is a topic close to my heart. I think it's important for people to keep in mind that usually much greater harm can come from just misunderstanding a thing that's working as intended. And it's just it's a failure of imagination on the part of the creator of this thing, that the user, whoever is experiencing this thing or interacting with this thing, just did not understand your intentions, did not understand what this thing is meant to do, what its strengths and weaknesses are. And even if it's unbiased.
We're talked about a lot of the basis of bias. I'd like to converge a little bit about what to do about it.
Yeah.
And assuming that many of the people listening and watching are not government officials, or not only in the largest of large companies, maybe somewhere in between, or maybe they don't have the resources, even if they are at a large company yet, to do things on a global basis. What about for that medium size or that group that's experimenting? They're starting to work with this now.
Yeah.
What is something someone can do to get going and see value maybe in a more of a point solution or a narrowly defined problem, and then grow from there?
If you're going to just make one move, this one's the one. Just go measure. Just go measure. Whatever it is that you're working on, whatever it is that actually has impact for your customers or within your organization, just go measure it. That's surprisingly few people do it. Even when they have the resources to do it, they just, for whatever reason, they don't measure it. Let's say your problem is hiring. Go ahead and really measure whatever it is you care about. Diversity, geographic location, just measure it. That's the first step. Before you can even mitigate something, you got to know if you have a problem to solve.
Well, John, thank you so much for your time and a very interesting discussion. And maybe we'll have you back again sometime.
Oh, it'd be a pleasure.